First of all, I would like to thank ICDI and Kanya for inviting me here. It's so great to see all the great work that Thailand government, CMU, and ICDI are doing to drive blockchain innovation. And I'm so deeply honored to be part of this in any way. So let me just introduce myself. I work with Blockchain Center Singapore. We are a non-profit global blockchain knowledge hub. Our key mission is to drive awareness and adoption of blockchain technology among organizations and individuals. So let me start by asking a question. How many of you here think health is more important than money? Okay. How many of you track your money or finances monthly or daily? Okay. How many of you track your health monthly or daily? So it's no surprise that the adoption of blockchain is much faster in banking than in healthcare. About 6 years ago, my grandmother fell very ill. She was admitted in a hospital. The doctors did all the tests, but they couldn't really diagnose what the problem was. And she had had many health checkups in the past, and there was nothing ever diagnosed, no chronic ailments, no diseases. But we had no health record or data of those tests. So after being in the hospital for 2 weeks, we decided to move her to another hospital. And the doctors there did not trust the results that were done in the previous hospital. So they did all the tests all over again. Of course, my grandmother was fairly old, so this was a little bit painful for her. But even after all those tests, the doctors could not diagnose the problem. Unfortunately, after being in the hospitals for almost a month, she passed on. And it was, as the last parent in the family, it was a little bit painful for us. And, but what was also more painful is that we couldn't really tell what actually led to her condition. We had no health records, no data, and it just seemed like such a big loss to see such a healthy person just pass away. But now, things are different. I've worked in the healthcare industry for almost 15 years because I'm very passionate about helping people live healthier. And today, I want to show you how blockchain can transform healthcare and help you live healthier lives. Blockchain can empower you not just to track your health, but also really understand your health. Get access to the best treatment options and the best healthcare services. And most importantly, have much better control over your own health and your body. So digitization has been the first step towards transforming healthcare. We have, in many hospitals and clinics, have electronic health records. These health records are shared with insurance companies so that they can design the best insurance products for us. They're shared with research institutes so that they can run research projects to develop the best products. And the data is also shared with manufacturers so that they can develop the best treatments and products for patients. But because of privacy laws, in the highly regulated healthcare industry, and the different software and databases that all of these parties in the ecosystem use, the power has now been taken away from the patient to the parties that hold the most data. And we always talk about how data is king now, right? So what we have now is a healthcare system which is highly fragmented, where the data is highly fragmented. There's huge friction in getting access to your own health data. There's high risk of high risk to data security. The data is stored in ways which is inadequately optimized for analytics, and let alone running machine learning or AI models. The claims settlement processes in insurance are highly inefficient and prone to fraud. The clinical research data is often questioned for its integrity. The patient enrollment process for clinical trials is highly inefficient. And last but not least, there are counterfeit drugs in the system which we are not able to identify. So why are we looking at blockchain to transform all of this? What exactly is blockchain? Kuntop very nicely explained blockchain with the village analogy. So maybe I'll share a slightly different way of looking at blockchain. The way I understand blockchain is that blockchain is a decentralized database which is distributed across a peer-to-peer network with no central authority or intermediary. The database is made up of blocks. That's why it's called a blockchain, because it's a chain of blocks. And each block is a set of transactions. So how does it work? Again, another way of looking at how the blockchain works. So if I initiate a transaction, say I send $100 to Kanya, and this transaction is broadcasted, and say all of you sitting here are nodes in the network. So I send $100 to Kanya. All of the transaction is broadcasted to this peer-to-peer network, where you get to validate that this transaction is accurate. And by accurate, I mean, like what Kuntop said, avoid the double spending problem. So you are validating that I do have $100 to begin with, and I am not using that twice. So I'm not sending it to Kanya as well as Kuntop at the same time. Once that is validated using a consensus, which means the rules by which all of us agree that this transaction will be evaluated. Once it is validated, it becomes part of this block. It becomes part of a block or a ledger or the ledger, and that block, once it is added to the chain of blocks, the transaction is completed. We often hear these words about blockchain. It is secure, it is transparent, it is immutable, and it is trustable. So what does it all mean? Security. Why is the blockchain secure? Because the database is distributed across the network, instead of sitting in a central or a database or server, each network participant has a copy of the ledger or the database. So there is no threat to a single point of failure or single point data breach. So if one node fails, the others still have the entire copy of the ledger, and therefore the blockchain can still continue. Blockchain is transparent. Why do we say transparent? Kuntop mentioned Litecoin. This is actually a snapshot of transactions of the Litecoin blockchain in 2018. What you see here on the left is the block. Each row here is actually a transaction. What you see on the block is what you see on the left is the block in which that transaction was added, the time when the transaction happened, the amount of Litecoin that was sent, and the value of the Litecoin. Everything is visible to everybody in the network. And therefore, any transaction that is made is transparent. What is interesting is that in May 2018, there was a transaction of 96 million US dollars that was made with a cost of 40 cents. And it took all of 150 seconds for that transaction to happen. Now, in the traditional world, if you were to make the same transaction, it would take several days for it to go through and cost a lot more money for it to happen. So therefore, on the blockchain, transactions are much cheaper and faster. So why is blockchain immutable? As I showed earlier, when the transaction is initiated, it is encrypted before being transmitted or broadcasted to the network. Once it is validated, it is again encrypted before it being added to the block. And before it's added to the chain, it is again being encrypted. So if somebody were to decide to hack or change my transaction, they will have to go through an entire, they will need huge amount of computing power to go back and decrypt all these codes all the way into the blockchain to actually change that one single transaction that I made. And that makes the blockchain almost impossible to hack. So why do we call it trustable? With all the security and the immutability and the transparency, that already builds a lot of trust. But what makes it even more trustable is smart contracts. Smart contract is nothing but a command or a code that allows any data or asset to be exchanged between two parties without the need for an intermediary or even trust. So if I were to send money to somebody or send data to somebody else, I don't necessarily need to trust that party. As long as there are rules that govern how the transaction will be taking place and when it will be shared. The audit trail or the provenance of the data, if when anything is changed by any of these parties on my health record, can be tracked because of the provenance and the audit trail. And because of the security and the immutability of the blockchain, the privacy laws and the security laws can be followed. The blockchain can make, with all of that, the blockchain can make the data or health records truly patient-centric. What that means is that my health records are mine, and I own them and I control them. And every other party that I interact with just adds the data onto my blockchain, which I have access to, and I decide how I want to share it. So all the data that actually comes out of all of these stakeholders and parties is held by me, and I can decide how to actually use it and I can put it on my health blockchain. Not only that, I can actually share it into the data lake. And the data lake is where all the raw data from all the patients and pretty much everybody and all the sources goes in, so that models, predictive models, AI models, machine learning models can actually be trained. Because as you all know, in order to develop an AI solution for a particular problem, the AI model needs to be trained on large volumes of data. And the problem with healthcare is that this data is not easily accessible because there are laws governing how this data can be shared from one party to another. So by putting the data on a data lake, it's now possible to train predictive or AI models to generate much more sophisticated predictions for diseases, for genetic testing, for treatment, development, you name it. Also, the blockchain allows the patient to decide how they want to share the data. So if I go to a doctor, I can actually give access to the doctor of my health data. They can make changes based on whatever they diagnose, and that can get captured on the blockchain as well into the data lake. This is just a quick example of a company that's doing something like this in Singapore. The company is called Medilot. And what they do is, as the patient goes to a hospital, they can access or they can download the Medilot app and give them permission to get their records from the hospital. And once they get the data once the app collects the data from the hospital, the patient can track their health and health reports throughout their life. And what this company also does is that it allows access to organizations to get this data and run predictive analytics and AI models on patient data. Claim settlement process. So let me ask you another question. How many of you have ever claimed any kind of insurance? Okay. How many of you think that it's a very fun process? Yeah, so I don't need to talk about the pain points of how painful a claim settlement process is. But what is also interesting is that each year, $272 billion is lost in insurance fraud in the United States alone. So what we can do, this is, I mean, again, this is, I think you're quite familiar with what happens in a current claim settlement process. So the patient in the healthcare setting, what happens at the back end is that the patient goes to an appointment, the provider checks their coverage, provides the service, and sends the billing information into the software. The provider then does the paper check, the paperwork, sends the paperwork to the clearinghouse. The clearinghouse checks it, audits it, formats it, and then sends it to the payer. And the payer judges the claim, evaluates, decides how much cost they want to cover based on the plan which has already been agreed upon with the payer and the patient, and then calculates the cost to the patient. And then the payer reimburses the provider based on the plan and sends a bill to the patient, and the patient finally pays. Now, a large part of this is just paperwork and checking and formatting and editing, which can be easily automated by a blockchain and placed on the blockchain. So what a claim settlement process will look like on the blockchain: the patient goes to the hospital for a surgery. At the same time, the patient informs the insurer and gives them permission to access their data. The clinical data is stored inside the health ID system of the hospital. The data and patient's public ID, remember the privacy laws need to be followed, so the data which is allowed and only the patient's public ID are put on the blockchain. Each transaction on the blockchain contains only the public ID of the patient, and the insurer can view and validate this data automatically and process the payment. It's as simple as that. It's a real-time, seamless process where the patient does not need to be involved. So with the blockchain, we can remove intermediaries. We can have event-triggered smart contracts. We can have much better efficiency at the back end. We can have better pricing and risk assessment. And last but not least, insurance companies can design real products which actually benefit people and not just follow the same legacy products that have generated sufficient revenue for them over the years. And also importantly, they can now serve populations with better pricing and solutions that serve populations which have not had the opportunity to have insurance in the past. And of course, no fraud. Because when everything is on the blockchain and everything is traceable, it's very difficult to go and hack and do something which you don't have the authority to. This is just another quick example of a company that's doing this in Singapore. So Vitana claims to be the first pilot project on the insurance. They are actually doing insurance for gestational diabetes for pregnant women. And what their main claim is that you'll never have to make a claim. So they tie up with women's health clinics, and if a patient is diagnosed with gestational diabetes, she is automatically sent $500. And if the patient happens to have any of these challenges during her pregnancy, she automatically receives $2,000 without doing any paperwork ever. Let's look at clinical trial management. Now, this is a little bit complicated process, but still worthwhile looking at, because in the United States, only 3% of adult cancer patients actually register for clinical trials. 80% of clinical trials are actually do not meet their patient enrollment timelines. And what that means is that it costs the pharma companies $8 million every single day the trial is delayed. Now, you might ask yourself, so what? Why should I care? Well, you should care because when these costs rack up, the price of the drug goes up. And that's the price you eventually have to pay to actually buy that drug when it finally gets launched. So this is still very, very critical. The current clinical trial process is very complicated. When a pharma company decides to do a trial, they hire a clinical research organization called a CRO, which then identifies sites where the trials need to be run. And the sites then recruit patients that will receive the drug and be part of the trial. Now here it looks like a very small number, but in reality this runs into thousands, because each clinical trial requires thousands of patients to be recruited and analyzed, and which means that the number of sites that are involved run into hundreds. Drug supply, supply chain. As I mentioned earlier, counterfeit drugs. $200 billion are lost each year to counterfeit drugs. Let me ask you a question. How many of you have ever taken a medicine? The rest of you have never taken a medicine? Wow. What are you guys eating? Okay, how many of you are 100% sure that the drug that you took was an original drug? Exactly, there's no way to know. But this is a problem, because counterfeit drugs enter the supply chain the same way that original drugs do. They come into the supply chain, they go through the same transit networks, they reach the same retailers, and end up with the same consumers. They're a threat to the healthcare system because there's a huge risk. There's a huge risk to the reputation and the credibility of the company that manufactures the original drug. Because of the internet, these counterfeit drugs have global reach, so it's very difficult to identify them. And because their safety is unknown, there are risks to patient lives. With the blockchain, tracing of drugs can be made much, much easier. This is just a very simple representation of how this would work. So the manufacturer produces the drug, and it marks it with a unique code, which goes on the blockchain. When the distributor receives it, or the wholesaler receives it, they verify the origin, and they again put that transaction on the blockchain. The pharmacist, when they receive the drug, they again check the origin, and that transaction goes on the blockchain. And finally, when the patient receives the drug, they verify its origin, and the transaction again goes on the blockchain. So every single party or stakeholder verifies its origin, and that becomes part of the immutable blockchain and can never be changed. This is an example from I wanted to show you how this really works in real life. So this is a company that we worked with. It's actually not Singaporean, it's based out of Australia, but still worthwhile looking at how this actually looks like when it goes on the blockchain. And what you will notice is it looks no different from what a regular application or system currently works. UCOT. So they open the app, they open the scanner, they scan the drug, and it shows exactly what the drug is. You can trace the UCOT blockchain, and it shows the entire provenance of that drug and how it has been checked by different parties. And here you can actually check how the drug has traveled and where it has actually, where was each party when they actually checked it. So it started traveling from there in China, it was checked in Melbourne, and then it finally reached Sydney, and it was recorded there. And this is just a quick example of how blockchain can help drug traceability in the supply chain. So I want to end with this message. As I mentioned in the beginning, blockchain has the power to transform healthcare and empower each and every one of us to live much healthier lives. We can now have access to all the data that we ever generated, whether it is from a pharmacy, a clinic, a hospital, our wearables, our sensors, anything that we ever measure can actually be put on the blockchain and be in the palm of our hands. It is up to us how we actually use it. And with Now with machine learning and AI and predictive models, it is even possible to use that data in ways that can actually help us live much healthier lives. And companies are also now incentivizing patients to share their data, to use their data, and actually there are insurance companies that are incentivizing people to use this data to live healthier and have much lesser insurance claims. But most importantly, and what's more exciting for me, is to see where this really goes. With all this information, with all this knowledge that we have, data has shown that in 2020, the amount of medical information that we will have will double in every 73 days. Imagine, with all that information, we have to have the power in our hands. It cannot be the hospitals, it cannot no longer be the doctors who can be the custodians of this knowledge and information. There's so much knowledge out there. We have to take it in our hands to make it work for us and make use of it to live much healthier. Because as we all know, when you empower people, magic happens. Thank you.